What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today's story is about a service member not trying to be an awful person and trying to defend a community at the beginning of the zombie apocalypse. So here we have The Last Stand. Act 1. The Awakening. The first screams came at 0347 hours. Sergeant Marcus Chen bolted upright in his bunk at Fort Bragg, muscle memory kicking in before his mind fully processed the chaos erupting outside. 22 years of service had taught him to distinguish between routine disturbances and genuine emergencies. This was neither. This was something else entirely. The base's emergency sirens wailed as Marcus grabbed his gear, fingers moving with practiced efficiency in the darkness. Through his barracks window, he could see figures stumbling across the parade ground in the pre-dawn gloom. Something was wrong with their movements. Too jerky, too aggressive, too wrong. "Chen!" Corporal Davies burst through the door, his usually composed face twisted with panic. "You need to see this, Sarge. The whole perimeter's been breached. But there aren't any insurgents or..." He paused, swallowing hard. "They're not alive." Marcus followed Davies outside, his M4 carbine ready. The scene that greeted him violated every law of nature he understood. Soldiers he'd served with for years were attacking their own comrades with teeth and nails, their eyes vacant, skin mottled gray. The wounded didn't stay down. They got back up, joining the attackers. "Fall back to the armory," Marcus shouted over the chaos, his training taking over even as his mind reeled. He grabbed Davies and two other soldiers, Private Kim and Specialist Rodriguez, and fought their way through the nightmare landscape that had been their home. The armory was a fortress of concrete and steel, but even as they barricaded themselves inside, Marcus could hear the infected. He refused to think the Z word, clawing at the walls. The base's communication systems were down, but the emergency broadcast painted a picture of global catastrophe. New York, LA, London, Tokyo, all dark. "What's the play, Sarge?" Rodriguez asked, checking his ammo. At 19, he was the youngest of their group, looking to Marcus for answers he didn't have. Marcus studied the base schematics, spread across the armory table. "We gather intel, collect supplies, and extract any survivors we can find. There's a civilian shelter 3 miles south, Millbrook Elementary. If anyone's alive in this sector, that's where they'd go." The plan was simple in theory. Use the armory's weapons and supplies to cut through the infected base, reach the motor pool, and drive to the civilian population center. In practice, it meant fighting through hundreds of turned soldiers who knew the base layout as well as they did. They moved at dawn, when the infected seemed less active. The base Marcus had called home was now a necropolis. Bodies littered the streets. Some still, others beginning to twitch back to unholy life. They reached the motor pool after 2 harrowing encounters, during which Marcus learned that headshots were the only reliable way to stop the infected permanently. The drive to Millbrook took them through suburban neighborhoods that looked like war zones. Abandoned cars blocked intersections, houses stood with doors hanging open, and infected wandered the streets in growing numbers. But the elementary school still flew an American flag, and smoke rose from its chimney. Marcus parked the Humvee behind the school and approached cautiously. A voice called out from behind the building. "That's far enough, soldier." "Sergeant Marcus Chen, U.S. Army," he called back. "We're here to help." A grizzled man emerged from behind a dumpster, hunting rifle trained at Marcus. "Name's Bill Harrison. I'm the principal here. Or was. Before this whole thing went to hell. You alone?" "3 others in my unit. How many survivors you got?" Bill's weathered face creased with relief. 43. Mostly kids and a few teachers. We've been holding out for 3 days, but food's running low, and those things are getting bolder. Marcus assessed the school's defenses as Bill led them inside. The building was well fortified, windows barricaded, choke points established, clear fields of fire. But it was also a trap. One breach, and everyone inside would be cornered. The survivors were a cross-section of small-town America, children ranging from 6 to 12, several teachers, a few parents who'd made it to the school when the outbreak began, and Bill himself. They looked at Marcus with desperate hope. "What's the situation out there, Sergeant?" asked Mrs. Patterson, a second-grade teacher who'd somehow managed to keep her class together through the apocalypse. Marcus chose his words carefully. "The infection is widespread. Military command structures broken down. We're on our own." He paused, meeting each adult's eyes. "But we're not giving up. We're going to get you somewhere safe." Act 2. The Crucible. The infected found them on the fourth night. Marcus was on watch when he heard the telltale scraping and moaning that had become the soundtrack of this new world. Through the school's reinforced windows, he could see them. Dozens of figures shambling across the playground, drawn by some invisible signal. "Contact!" he whispered into the radio, waking his team. "Multiple infected approaching from the east. This is not a drill." The school's PA system crackled to life as Bill broadcast the rehearsed evacuation protocol. Children who should have been learning multiplication tables instead grabbed their assigned emergency bags and moved to predetermined positions with military precision. The first infected reached the school's main entrance at 0230 hours. The reinforced doors held, but Marcus could hear more arriving by the minute. Through the security monitors, they had managed to keep running. He watched the playground fill with bodies. "How many?" Davies asked, checking his rifle's magazine. "Too many," Marcus replied grimly. 60, maybe 70, and more coming. The infected weren't mindless. Marcus had learned that over the past few days. They communicated somehow, coordinated their attacks. When one found prey, others followed. The school had become a beacon in the darkness, drawing every infected for miles. The eastern barricade failed first. A classroom window that had been weakened by repeated impacts finally shattered, allowing 3 infected to pour through. Mrs. Patterson screamed as rotting hands grabbed for 6-year-old Tommy Mitchell. Marcus moved without thinking, his rifle barking 3 times in rapid succession. The infected dropped, but the sound attracted more. The careful silence they'd maintained was broken. "Rodriguez, Kim, reinforce the east wall," Marcus shouted. "Davies, get the kids to the gym. Bill, you're with me." The next hour was a nightmare of gunfire, screaming and desperate improvisation. They fell back room by room, using the school's layout to funnel the infected into killing zones. But for every one they dropped, 2 more seemed to take its place. "We can't hold!" Davies called out as the infected poured through a breach in the north wall. "There's too many!" Marcus made a decision that would haunt him forever. The school had a natural gas line running to the cafeteria. If they could create an explosion. "Everyone to the gym!" he ordered. "Now! Davies, help me with this!" While the others evacuated, Marcus and Davies rigged an improvised explosive, using the gas line and emergency flares. They had maybe 3 minutes before the building would be overrun. The explosion lit up the sky, taking out a significant portion of the infected horde and buying them precious time. But the school was burning. Their sanctuary was destroyed. 43 survivors huddled in the parking lot as their refuge burned behind them. They had limited supplies, no shelter, and infected were already being drawn to the flames from across the town. "What now, Sergeant?" Bill asked, quietly, holding a sobbing 7-year-old. Marcus looked at the faces around him, scared, exhausted, but still alive. His military training warred with the reality of their situation. By the book, he should find a defensible position and wait for extraction that might never come. But these weren't soldiers. They were innocents who'd placed their trust in him. "We move north," he decided. "There's a ranger station in the state forest, about 15 miles. Isolated, defensible, with its own water supply. We travel at night and we stay off the main roads." The journey began immediately. Marcus organized them into a column. Davies and Rodriguez as scouts, Kim bringing up the rear, with the civilians protected in the middle. They moved through the backyards and side streets, avoiding the main arteries where infected congregated. By dawn, they'd covered 8 miles. The group was exhausted, and several of the younger children could barely walk. They took shelter in an abandoned farmhouse, posting guards while the others rested. It was there that Marcus learned the full scope of their situation. Kim had managed to get a working radio, and the news was devastating. Major cities were completely overrun. The military was in full retreat. The president was missing, presumed dead. Isolated pockets of survivors were scattered across the country, but organized resistances had collapsed. So what's the point? Rodriguez asked bitterly. We're just prolonging the inevitable. Marcus understood the youngest soldier's despair. But he'd made a choice back at that school. These people, these children, represented something worth preserving. Maybe they couldn't save the world, but they could save this small piece of it. The point, Marcus said firmly, is that we're still human. We still choose how we face the end. And I choose to fight. Act 3. The Last Stand. The ranger station was perfect. It was too perfect. Perched on a wooded hill with clear sight lines in all directions, supplied with solar power and a natural spring. It should have been empty. Instead, Marcus could see movements through the windows and smoke from the chimney. Could be survivors, Davy suggested, hopefully. Marcus studied the building through binoculars. Could be, or it could be a trap. He'd heard reports of survivors turning on each other, desperate people doing desperate things. They'd approached carefully, leaving the main group hidden in the tree line. The station's occupants saw them coming. Marcus counted at least 6 figures watching from windows. That's close enough, a voice called out when they reached the station's perimeter. State your business. Sergeant Marcus Chen, U.S. Army. We have civilian survivors, including children. We need shelter. A long pause. Then the front door opened. A woman emerged, mid-30s, wearing ranger gear, carrying a shotgun with practiced confidence. I'm Ranger Sarah Walsh. This is my station. She studied Marcus's group, her expression unreadable. How many? 43 total, mostly kids. Something shifted in Walsh's expression. Kids? She lowered her weapon slightly. Bring 'em up. But your people stay armed and visible. We've had bad experiences with strangers. The ranger station had become a fortress. Walsh and her 5 companions, 3 other rangers and 2 local hunters, had been holding the position for a week. They had reinforced the windows, established firing positions, and created an early warning system using motion sensors placed throughout the surrounding forest. We can make room, Walsh said after meeting with the children, but resources are limited. Food for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. Marcus nodded. We'll pull our weight. My people are trained, and some of the civilians have useful skills. That night, around a carefully shielded campfire, Marcus learned about the station's previous occupants. A group of 20 refugees had arrived 4 days earlier, claiming to be survivors from a church group. It seemed legit, until they tried to take the station by force, believing the Rangers were hoarding supplies. We held them off, Walsh said quietly, but barely. Lost 2 good people. That's when we decided, no more strangers. But you let us in. Walsh looked toward the building where 43 people were settling in for the night. Kids changed the equation. Besides, you've got the look. What look? The look of someone who's decided to make a stand. For 2 weeks, their makeshift community worked. The children attended improvised classes taught by the teachers. The adults organized patrols, maintained equipment, and planned for long-term survival. Marcus found himself becoming not just a military leader, but a community organizer, mediating disputes and making impossible decisions about resource allocation. But the infected found them eventually. They always did. The motion sensors triggered at 0400 on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was instantly awake, his trained instincts recognizing the pattern. Not 1 or 2 infected, but a massive horde moving through the forest with purpose. Through the ranger station surveillance systems, they watched a sea of bodies emerge from the tree line. Hundreds of infected, drawn by some signal Marcus couldn't identify. They moved with more coordinated than he'd ever seen, spreading out to surround the station. "How do they find us?" Davies asked, checking his rifle. Walsh answered grimly. "Doesn't matter now. We've got maybe an hour before they reach the perimeter." Marcus assembled his people, military and civilian alike. In 2 weeks, Bill Harrison had become a decent shot. Mrs. Patterson could reload magazines faster than some soldiers. Even the older children had learned to spot infected movement patterns. But math was math. They had perhaps 20 effective fighters against hundreds of infected. "We have 2 choices," Marcus told the assembled group. "We can try to break out, make a run for vehicles, and hope some of us escape. Or, we can make our stand here." "What are the odds we've run?" Bill asked. Marcus was honest. "Maybe 10% of us make it. The children? Probably none." The silence stretched long. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke up. "These kids have been through enough. They deserve better than dying afraid in the woods." One by one, the others nodded agreement. Even the children understood. This was where they made their stand. The battle began at dawn. The infected came in waves, testing different approaches, probing for weaknesses. Marcus coordinated the defense from the station's radio room, directing fire and managing ammunition supplies that dwindled with each passing hour. The first breach came at the east wall, where repeated impacts had weakened the reinforced windows. Davies died holding that position, buying time for Walsh to seal the breach with furniture and desperate gunfire. By noon, they'd fallen back to the station's central building, infected pouring through the outer defenses, forcing Marcus to make increasingly desperate decisions. Rodriguez volunteered for a suicide mission to destroy a cluster of infected with improvised explosives. Kim held the stairwell until his ammunition ran out, then continued fighting with a fire axe until the infected overwhelmed him. As the sun began to set, Marcus found himself in the station's radio room with the last survivors: Walsh, Bill, Mrs. Patterson, and 12 children. The infected filled the lower floors, clawing at the barricaded door that was their final defense. "How long?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly, comforting a terrified 8-year-old. Marcus checked his remaining ammo. 3 magazines. Maybe an hour. But the radio crackled to life, interrupting his grim calculations. A voice tinged with static, but unmistakably official. Any stations! This is Colonel Morrison, U.S. Army Northern Command. We are establishing evacuation zones. If you can hear this transmission, rally to these coordinates." Marcus grabbed the microphone. "Colonel, this is Sergeant Chen. We have civilian survivors, including children, at the Millbrook Ranger Station. We are under heavy attack and require immediate extraction." The response came quickly. "Sergeant Chen, we have helicopters inbound to your location. ETA, 15 minutes. Can you hold?" Marcus looked at the door, which was beginning to splinter under the infected assault. He looked at the children huddled behind inadequate cover. He looked at the people who trusted him to save them. "Roger, Colonel. We'll hold." The final 15 minutes lasted forever. The door failed, and infected poured into their last refuge. Marcus and Walsh held the stairwell while Bill and Mrs. Patterson shepherded the children to the roof. Every bullet had to count. Every second fought for desperately. Marcus heard the helicopters before he saw them. The beautiful sound of rotors cutting through air. Military voices in the radio, professional and competent, coordinated a combat extraction. "Smoke popped. LZ is hot. Repeat, LZ is hot." The roof access was blocked by infected, forcing them to make their final stand in the radio room. Marcus had 1 magazine left when the first child was lifted to safety. 2 rounds remaining when Mrs. Patterson was pulled aboard the second helicopter. He was down to his sidearm when strong hands grabbed him, hauling him toward the helicopter's door. Below, the ranger station was completely overrun, infected swarming like ants on a dropped sandwich. But they'd held. They were alive because a sergeant had decided that some things were worth dying for. The evacuation zone was a fortified city built from the remnants of human civilization. Military discipline married to civilian ingenuity, creating something new from the ashes of the old world. Marcus learned that similar enclaves existed across the country, connected by radio and hope. slowly reclaiming territory from the infected. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the cemetery of New Haven, the name they'd given their community. Graves marked with simple wooden crosses, bearing the names of Davies, Rodriguez, Kim, and all the others who'd made their survival possible. Mrs. Patterson approached, leading a group of children who'd grown taller and stronger in their new home. "Tell us about Sergeant Davies again," 8-year-old Tommy requested. "The one who held the east wall." Marcus smiled, remembering his friend's terrible jokes and unwavering courage. Davies was a soldier who understood that some battles are worth fighting, even when you can't win. Especially when you can't win. As the sun set over New Haven's walls that protected 3,000 survivors and growing, Marcus understood that they hadn't just survived the zombie apocalypse. They discovered something humanity had almost lost. That civilization wasn't about building or technology or governments. It was about choosing to protect each other, even when the world ended. It was about making a stand. The end. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. I'll be honest, I'm kind of a sucker nowadays for happy endings. I'm not sure when it changed from enjoying sad endings to enjoying happy endings, but if you can't tell lately, almost every one of my stories has had a happy ending. So I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.
What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. I know I'm bouncing back and forth between having like the actual camera and like a static background, but I'm just trying to hone in on what exactly I want this to be. I'm a little afraid that if I use just the static background, people think it's an AI. I have a bit of a monotone voice, and sometimes I just don't actually feel like having the camera on, so that's why I don't have the camera on sometimes. But tonight we have it on, and tonight I have a story about a person with agoraphobia trying to survive the beginning of the zombie apocalypse. The static on the TV was a constant low hum, a lullaby of the end times. For days, maybe a week, I've been holed up in my apartment, watching the world unravel through a grimy window. The news, when it flickered through the snowy screen, spoke of a rapidly spreading illness, of quarantines that failed, of cities silenced. But I knew. We all knew. The shambling figures in the streets below, the guttural moans that sometimes drifted up through the thick glass, those weren't sick people. They were something else. Act 1. The Prison of Walls. My apartment became my tomb. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan from outside, sent a jolt of ice through my veins. The canned goods I've stockpiled for a hypothetical snowstorm seemed laughably inadequate now. Water was running low. The power had flickered off and on. A dying heartbeat before finally going dark 2 days ago. Now, on the lingering twilight from the window offered any illumination. My greatest fear wasn't the monster outside. It was the monster inside me. Fear. It had solidified. A lead weight in my gut, pressing me down, nailing my feet to the floorboards. The thought of stepping out, of seeing one of them up close, of hearing their ragged breathing, paralyzed me. I'd seen enough of the news before the signal died. The clawing hands, the vacant eyes, the insatiable hunger. One evening, a faint scratching began at my door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It wasn't a human knock. It was something slow and deliberate, like a fingernail dragging across wood. I pressed my ear to the cold metal, barely daring to breathe. A low, wet gurgle, followed by a faint thud, as if something heavy had slumped against the doorframe. Then, silence. The scratching returned, softer this time, a persistent, unsettling rhythm. I backed away, pressing myself into the darkest corner of the living room. pathetic statue of terror. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every shadow danced with horrors. Every distant wail outside my window amplified into a personal threat. Hunger gnawed, a dull ache that intensified with each passing hour. Thirst became a burning in my throat. I knew, logically, that staying here meant a slow, agonizing death. But the thought of leaving, of facing the nightmare realm beyond my door, was a terror so profound it eclipsed all else. Days bled into formless blur, my dwindling supplies mirrored by dwindling hope. The silence outside was sometimes more terrifying than the noise, a deceptive calm before an unseen storm. I started talking to myself, whispering desperate prayers, arguing with the phantom fear that had become my constant companion. "I have to go," I'd croak, my voice rough from disuse. "You'll die here." But my feet remained rooted. One morning, the light flickered through the window seemed different, harsher. I stumbled toward it, my joints aching, my head swimming. The street below, usually populated by a scattering of the undead, was empty. Utterly, eerily empty. My breath hitched. They moved on? Was this a chance? Or was it a trap? A calculated silence designed to lure out the last survivors? The scratching at the door began again, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, wet thud. It wasn't just scratching, it was gouging. I could hear the wood splintering. They were still out there, and they were getting in. Act 2. The first step. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had no choice. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Staying meant being torn apart within the confines of my own home. Leaving, while terrifying, at least offered a sliver of hope, a chance, however slim, at survival. My hands trembled as I rummaged through the drawers, pulling out anything that could be a weapon: a rusty screwdriver, a heavy, old flashlight, a kitchen knife. Pathetic. I knew it. But it was all I had. I strapped a small backpack to my shoulders, filled with the last of my crackers and a half-empty water bottle. The key in the lock felt like a block of ice. My breath hitched in my throat, each beat of my heart a frantic drum solo. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed in the deathly quiet of the apartment. I paused, hand on the doorknob, listening. Nothing. Only the rasping of my own breath. With a surge of adrenaline, I flung the door open, ready to face whatever horror lurked on the other side. The hallway was dark, eerily silent. No shambling figures. No guttural moans. Just dust motes dancing in the faint light flickering from the stairwell. My eyes scanned the shadows. Paranoia, cold hands squeezing my heart. Is this a trick? My first step out was in agony. My legs felt like lead, my muscles screaming in protest. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a lurking threat. I clutched the kitchen knife, its dull edge a cold comfort in my sweaty palm. The air in the hallway was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. I made my way down the stairs, each creak of the old wood a thunderclap on the silence. The lobby was a wasteland of overturned furniture and scattered papers. A faint scratching sound drew my attention to the front doors. Pressed against the glass, their faces distorted by hunger and rot. There were two of them. Their eyes, milky and blank, seemed to fix on me. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched. This was it. The moment I dreaded. They were real. They were close. One of them lunged, its rotted hand slamming against the glass, leaving a sickening smear. A low moan, a sound of profound and endless hunger, rattled the glass. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst out. Then, something inside of me shifted. The terror was still there, a cold, persistent tremor. But beneath it, a tiny spark ignited. Anger. Fury. At them. At the world. At myself for letting fear consume me for so long. I turned and ran. Not mindlessly, but with a sudden, desperate purpose. Back exit. I remembered seeing a fire escape during one of my terrified glances out the window weeks ago. It was my only chance. Act 3. The first breath of air. The back alley was a junkyard of forgotten dreams. Overflowing dumpsters, overturned bins, a broken down car. The air was thick with the stench of garbage and something else. Something metallic and sweet. I scrambled over a discarded mattress, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The fire escape was steep, its metal rungs slick with grime. I started climbing, my hands raw, my muscles protesting with every upward lunge. Below, a low growl echoed from the alley entrance. They were coming. I reached the roof, gasping, my body screaming in protest. The city skyline spread out before me, a haunting mosaic of dark, empty buildings. Smoke plumed in the distance. The sun, a blood-orange orb, hung low on the horizon. But the silence on the rooftop was different from the silence in my apartment. This was an open, vast silence, broken only by the distant wail of a siren, or the faint, echoing moan of the unliving. But for the first time in weeks, I took a deep, shaky breath that didn't smell of stale air and fear. It smelled of concrete, of dust, of the dying city. It smelled of possibility. I was still terrified. The fear was a persistent hum in my bones, a constant reminder of the hell I'd just escaped and the horrors that still lurked. But something had shifted. The walls of my self-imposed prison had crumbled. I had faced the door. I had opened it, and I'd walked through. I was alive. And more importantly, I was moving. I looked up at the desolate landscape, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. The world was broken, but I was not. Not yet. This was just the beginning, and I was finally ready to fight for my end. Act 4. The Gauntlet. The rooftop offered a momentary reprieve, but I knew it wouldn't last. The sun dipped lower, casting long, unsettling shadows. I scanned the adjacent buildings. Most were residential, like mine, but a few looked like small businesses. Pharmacy, maybe, or a convenience store. Hope, a dangerous flicker, stirred in my chest. Supplies, real supplies. Getting there was the problem. The gap between my building and the next was a dizzying chasm. I'd have to find a way across. Looking around, I spotted a rickety old wooden plank, likely used by maintenance workers for a quick fix. It was warped and splintered, but long enough. It was terrifying. One misstep, and I'd be a smeared mess on the alley floor. But the thought of turning back, of returning to the nightmare below, was even worse. With agonizing slowness, I dragged the plank to the edge. My hands were already raw. Now they were stinging with splinters. I pushed it across, watching with bated breath as I settled it with a soft thud on the opposing roof. It wasn't perfectly stable, bowing slightly in the middle. My stomach clenched. I got down on my hands and knees. My heart hammering, began to crawl. Every inch was a battle against vertigo, against the nagging voice in my head screaming about the fall. The wood groaned beneath my weight. I closed my eyes, focusing only on the rough texture of the plank beneath my palms. I made it. I pulled myself onto the next rooftop, collapsing in a gasping heap. My entire body trembled, but a wild, exhilarated laugh escaped my lips. I'd done it. I'd faced the tangible, deadly obstacle and overcome it. This new rooftop was even more desolate than mine. A few abandoned birdhouses, a broken antenna. I crept to the edge, peering down into the street. It was a main thoroughfare, and the sight below made my blood run cold. There were dozens of them, shambling, moaning figures, some dragging limbs, others with gaping wounds. They moved with a slow, relentless purpose, like a tide of death. I needed to find a way down. The building had fire escapes on the side, but they descended directly into the mass of the undead. I'd be swarmed. So I scanned the immediate surrounding areas. A large industrial air conditioner unit hummed faintly on the roof. Below it, I noticed a bolted down ladder leading down to a lower, enclosed patio area of a restaurant. A long shot, but a safer one. Carefully, I made my way to the ladder. The metal was cold against my hands, and as I descended, I could hear them below. Sounds seemed to amplify. My stomach churned. This was a direct path into the heart of the beast. The alternative was starvation. The patio was overgrown with weeds. Tables overturned. Chairs scattered like discarded bones. A broken glass door led into the restaurant. I pushed it open slowly, the crunch of shattered glass echoing in the silent space. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale food and decay. The restaurant was a wreck. Tables were overturned, plates smashed. I moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. Kitchen. That's where the food would be. I pushed open the swinging door, revealing a scene of utter chaos. Pots and pans lay strewn across the floor, spilled food rotting on the countertops. Then I heard it. A soft, wet thud from behind the counter. I gripped my knife tighter, the rusty screwdriver clenched in my other hand like a useless talisman. I held my breath, straining my ears. A low, gurgling sound, closer. Shadow moved. My eyes darted to the source. A figure, slumped behind the counter, its back to me. It was small, hunched. My heart hammered. Was it a child? A survivor? One of them. Act 5. The First Contact. I took a shaky step forward, then another. The stench of decay was overpowering now, mixed with something else, something sweet and sickly. The figure stirred, a slow, deliberate movement. It turned its head just slightly. It wasn't a child. It was small, yes, but its skin was a mottled green-gray. Its clothes torn and stained. A low growl rumbled in its throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. Its eyes were dull and rolled toward me. Fear, cold and absolute, slammed into me. This was it. Face to face. The first time. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze, rooted to the spot. The creature lunged. It wasn't fast, not like I'd imagined, but its movements were jerky and unnatural. Its mouth, a gaping maw of rotting teeth, snapped at the air. I stumbled back, tripping over a fallen chair. My head hit the cold tile floor with a sickening thud. Stars exploded behind my eyes. Pain lanced through my skull, but my terror was great. I scrambled forward, desperately trying to put distance between myself and the snarling thing. It was surprisingly persistent, dragging itself towards me, its hands outstretched, claws snapping. In my desperation, my hand closed around something cold and metallic, the rusty screwdriver. Without thinking and without planning, driven purely by the primal urge to survive, I thrust it forward. It found purchase, a sickening squelch as it pierced through something soft. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched inhuman sound that scraped against my eardrums. Its body spasmed, thrashing violently. Its hands flailed, its fingers brushing my face, leaving a cold, clammy trail. I screamed, a raw animal sound, and pushed harder, twisting the screwdriver. Its movement slowly ceased. The gurgling stopped. The eyes remained open, milky and vacant, staring up at the fluorescent lights that would never flicker on again. I lay there, panting, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. The air was thick with the stench of death. My head throbbed. Blood, not mine, was smeared on my hands. Killed it. Killed one of them. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving me weak and nauseous. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling. My reflection in a shattered mirror above a defunct sink showed a wild-eyed, terrified man, streaked with dirt and blood. There was something else there too. flicker of something new. Grim determination. I was still afraid. I would always be afraid. But I had faced the nightmare, and I had, for a moment, fought back. The world was still a chaotic, terrifying place. I was still here. I was no longer just hiding. I was fighting. I moved to the pantry, my hands still shaking. I grabbed a can of peaches, another of beans, a bag of stale crackers. As I filled my backpack, I thought of the outside, of the endless gauntlet that awaited me. But for the first time, the paralyzing dread was tempered by a strange, fierce resolve. I had stepped out of the shadows, and I was going to keep. Well, that's going to be the end of his story. The reason why I do a lot of these 12 hours of the zombie apocalypse stories is because I think it's very interesting in like the movies or books or anything like that when people come face to face with the zombies for the first time. Whether that be hiding in their house, whether that be on TV, whether that be face to face fighting them, I always find it extremely interesting to see how different people would react to something like this. All the stories we have done have been people who are fighting back, but I guarantee there would be a ton of people that would just not know what to do and would freeze up and would just die. It's awful to say, but the reason why I don't do those stories is obvious. It'd be like 5 sentences and they're dead. It would not be an interesting story to go with. But I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.
What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. If you've been listening to this channel for long enough, you know that this channel started with creepypastas. So we're going to go back a little bit, but we're going to have a zombie twist on it. So this is a zombie story with a bit of a creepypasta twist. Hope you guys enjoy it. The broadcast signal intrusion. I need to tell someone about what happened 3 months ago. I've been carrying this alone, but I can't anymore. The nightmares won't stop, and I keep seeing them in crowds, in reflections, in the corner of my eye. Maybe writing this down will help. Maybe someone will believe. My name is Marcus Chen, and I worked as a broadcast engineer for KWTV Channel 7 in Oklahoma City. It was a decent job, quiet most of the time. I handled the technical side of transmissions, made sure our signal stayed clear, and our equipment didn't fail during the news or primetime shows. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and let me work mostly alone in the station's transmission facility, about 20 miles outside the city. The facility itself was pretty isolated. Just a squat, concrete building surrounded by transmission towers and satellite dishes. During my night shifts, I'd be the only person there for miles. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to think, to work on personal projects, to enjoy the strange peace that comes with being responsible for beaming television signals to thousands of homes across central Oklahoma. That changed on October 13th. I was running diagnostics on our main transmitter around 2:30 a.m. when the first anomaly appeared. First, I thought it was just interference. We'd get occasional signal bleed from other stations, atmospheric disturbances, that sort of thing. This was different. Instead of our late-night movie broadcast, static filled the screen for exactly 17 seconds. Then, clear as day, I saw a man standing in what looked like a hospital corridor. He was wearing scrubs. They were torn and stained with something dark. His face was pale, almost gray. And his eyes were completely black. Not like his pupils were dilated, but like someone had filled his eye sockets with ink. He stood perfectly still, staring directly into the camera, for maybe 3 seconds before our regular programming resumed. I immediately checked our incoming feeds. Everything looked normal on our end. Called the network, thinking maybe they'd had some kind of technical glitch during their overnight programming. But they insisted their signal had been clean all night. When I described what I'd seen, the technician on duty laughed and suggested I cut back on the energy drinks. But I knew what I saw. I'd been doing this job for 8 years, and I could tell the difference between a technical error and actual broadcast content. That man, that thing in the hospital corridor, it had been real footage of something. I started recording everything after that night. The intrusions happened irregularly at first. Sometimes 3 or 4 nights would pass without incident. Then I'd get hit with 2 or 3 in a single shift. They always lasted exactly 17 seconds. They always replaced whatever was supposed to be broadcasting at that moment. Local commercials, network programming, even emergency alert tests. The signal would override everything. The content varied, but it was always disturbing. I saw empty hospital rooms with beds that had clearly been slept in recently, their sheets twisted and stained. I saw parking garages where cars sat with their doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered on the asphalt. I saw residential streets where front doors stood ajar and children's toys lay abandoned on the sidewalk. And I saw the people. They appeared in every broadcast, sometimes just 1 or 2, sometimes groups of them. They all had that same gray pallor, those same black eyes. Moved wrong, too slow, and too fast, like they were adjusting to bodies that didn't quite fit anymore. In one transmission, I watched a woman in a blood-stained wedding dress crawl across the floor of what looked like a church. Her movements jerky, her head tilted at an angle that should have been impossible. The worst part was how they looked at the camera. They always knew it was there. They would stop whatever they were doing and stare directly into the lens with those empty black eyes, as if they could see through the broadcast signal and directly into the transmission facility where I sat watching. I tried to trace the source of the signal, but it was unlike anything I'd encountered. The metadata showed it was coming from our own transmitter, which was impossible. I ran every diagnostic I could think of, replaced components, even had our parent company send out their best engineers to check the system. Everything tested normal. That's when I realized the timestamps were wrong. Each intrusion was labeled with the broadcast time, but when I cross-referenced them with our actual transmission logs, they didn't match. The timestamp showed dates that were still weeks in the future. At first, I thought it was just a software glitch. The pattern was too consistent. Every single anomalous broadcast was timestamped for a date that hadn't happened yet. November 3rd appeared most frequently. I became obsessed with that date. I started a countdown, marking off days on my calendar like a prisoner waiting for release. I couldn't shake the feeling of whatever happened in these broadcasts. Whatever had turned these people into the gray-skinned, black-eyed things I kept seeing was going to happen on November 3rd. As the date approached, the broadcasts became more frequent and more disturbing. I saw hospitals filled with motionless figures lying in beds, connected to machines that beeped steadily in empty rooms. I saw city streets where cars had crashed into storefronts, their drivers slumped over steering wheels. I saw what looked like news studios, where anchors sat at their desks, staring blankly into cameras that no longer recording. On November 1st, I saw my own transmission facility. The broadcast showed our building from the outside. The same squat concrete structure surrounded by towers that I'd worked in for years. Something was wrong with the image. The parking lot was filled with abandoned cars. Several of the transmission towers had collapsed. Dark stains covered the concrete walls, and every window had been shattered. Then the camera moved inside. I watched in horror as I traveled through corridors I walked every day, past equipment I maintained, into the very control room where I sat watching. The room was destroyed. Control panels had been ripped apart, cables hung from the ceiling like vines, and the floor was covered with broken glass and dried blood. In my chair, my actual chair, sat one of them. Wore my clothes, my KWTV uniform shirt and jeans, but its skin had that same gray pallor. And when it turned to look at the camera, I saw those terrible black eyes. It smiled with my face, and I could see its teeth that had been filed to points. The thing that looked like me held up a hand to the camera. Written across its palm, in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "See you soon, Marcus." I ran that night. I didn't even shut down the equipment properly. I just grabbed my keys and drove straight home. I called in sick for the next 2 days, too petrified to return to the facility. Couldn't stop thinking about that final timestamp. November 3rd, 2:47 a.m. On November 2nd, couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if what I'd seen had actually happened. I drove back to the facility around midnight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Everything looked normal when I arrived. The tower stood straight and intact. The parking lot was empty except for my car, and all the windows were whole. I let myself into the building and made my way to the control room, half expecting to find my gray-skinned doppelganger waiting for me. The room was exactly as I left it. Equipment hummed normally. Monitors displayed their usual readouts. My chair sat empty in the main console. I checked the clock. 12:47 a.m. Exactly 2 hours until the timestamp from the final broadcast. Should have left then. I should have gotten back in my car and driven as far as possible. Instead, I sat down at my console and waited. The broadcast started immediately. Every few minutes, another 17-second intrusion would interrupt our signal. I saw scenes of chaos and horror from places I didn't recognize. Collapsed buildings, burning cars, hospitals where the emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow. And always, those gray figures with those black eyes, moving through the destruction like sleepwalkers. At 2:45 a.m., our signal went dead. The monitors went black. The equipment stopped humming, and even the emergency lighting failed. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the distant hum of the transmission towers outside. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., everything came back online. It wasn't our signal anymore. The main monitor showed a live feed of the control room, the exact view from where a camera would be if someone had mounted one on the wall behind me. I could see myself sitting at the console, staring at the screen in horror. But there was something else in the image, something the camera could see that I couldn't. Standing directly behind my chair was one of them. It had the same gray skin, the same black eyes as all the others. This one was different. It was wearing a broadcast engineer's uniform like mine, but the fabric looked old and rotten, as if it had been buried for months. Its name tag read Marcus Chen. I spun around in my chair, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but when I looked back at the monitor, the thing was still visible on screen, standing behind where I sat. It raised one decomposing hand and pointed directly at the camera, at me. The screen went black again, and when it came back online, it was showing our regular programming, a rerun of some sitcom from the 90s. Everything appeared normal. The equipment readings were stable. The signal was clean, and according to our logs, there had been no interruption in service. But I knew better. I quit the next morning. I told my supervisor I was having health problems and needed to take indefinite leave. I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason. How could I tell anyone that I'd been watching broadcasts from a future where something terrible had happened, where people had become something else, something hungry and wrong? That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been monitoring news reports, watching for any sign that what I saw might be starting to happen. There have been isolated incidents, a few unexplained deaths in hospitals, some reports of people acting strangely before disappearing, but nothing that could make the national news, nothing that would make people pay attention. I know it's coming. I tried to convince myself that it was all stress-induced hallucinations, that maybe I really did need to cut back on the energy drinks and get sleep. But then I'll be walking through a crowd and catch a glimpse of gray skin out of the corner of my eye. I'll see someone standing too still, moving too wrong. And for just a moment, I'll catch sight of those terrible black eyes before they disappear into the crowd. They're here. They're waiting. And I think they're spreading. 2 weeks ago, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson stopped waving to me. I got my mail. She just stands at her window and stares. Her skin looks paler than it used to. When I saw her up close yesterday, I could swear her eyes were darker than they should be. Last week, The barista at my usual coffee shop moved differently. Too slow and then too fast. Like she was getting used to her body all over again. When she handed me my change, her fingers were cold as ice. I've been thinking about those timestamps again. The ones that showed dates in the future. What if they weren't predictions? What if they were instructions? What if somewhere, someone had been broadcasting a signal that doesn't just show what will happen, but makes it happen? What if it wasn't just watching the future? What if I was helping to create it? Keep thinking about that final broadcast. The one that showed the thing wearing my face, sitting in my chair. It knew my name. It was waiting for me. And now, 3 months later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring into mirrors a little too long, checking my reflection for signs of change. My skin still has its normal color. My eyes are still brown. But I can feel something different underneath. Something cold and patient and hungry. I don't think I have much time left. If you're reading this, if you work in broadcasting or know of someone who does, watch for signal intrusions. 17 seconds of content that doesn't belong. Timestamps for dates that haven't happened yet. If you see them, don't try to trace the source like I did. Don't wait around to see if they come true. Just run. And if you see me somewhere, if you recognize my name or my face from some missing persons report or news story, do me a favor. Don't look directly into my eyes. By then, they probably won't be brown anymore. By then, I probably won't be me. The signal is still out there, still broadcasting, still spreading, and November 3rd happens every year. I can hear them calling to me now, through the static between radio stations, through the white noise of dead television channels. They're telling me it's time to come home, time to take my place in the control room, time to help spread the signals to new markets, new territories, new victims. The broadcast must go on. The broadcast must grow. And we need more engineers. This account was found on Marcus Chen's laptop after he disappeared from his apartment on March 15th. His neighbors reported seeing him walk to his car around 2:47 a.m., moving in what they described as a strange, jerky way, like he was sleepwalking. His car was found 3 days later in the parking lot of KWTV's transmission facility. Doors open, keys still in the ignition. The facility itself showed no signs of disturbance, and according to station records, no one had accessed the building that night. Security footage from the facility's exterior cameras showed Marcus' car arriving at 2:45 a.m. The footage shows Marcus getting out of the car and walking toward the building, but he is not seen entering. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the cameras experienced what technicians described as 17 seconds of interference. When the cameras came back online, Marcus's car was in the parking lot, but Marcus himself was nowhere to be seen. KWTV reports no unusual broadcasts or signal intrusions during this time period. However, several viewers in the Oklahoma City area called the station on March 15th to report brief interruptions in their late-night programming. Exactly 17 seconds of static, followed by images of empty hospital corridors and abandoned city streets. Marcus Chen remains missing. If you have any information about his whereabouts, please contact local authorities. Do not approach him if you see him. Do not look directly into his eyes. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. I'm still a sucker for creepypasta style stories. And these are just fun to read, honestly, for me. It's like a nice fresh breath air from the 12 hours of surviving the zombie apocalypse stories. But I hope you enjoyed. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears. You say bye?
Bye.
Bye, guys. Have a good night. Or day, or whatever time it is for you.
What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. I've been watching a bunch of those Fear Street shows or the movies on Netflix lately, and I felt like I wanted to write a zombie-style version of something like that At least that style of story. So I came up with The Night Shift at Shadowbrook Storage. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Maya Rodriguez clocked in for another night shift at Shadowbrook Storage. The digital display on the time clock read 11:47 p.m., and she was already 13 minutes late. Again. "Cutting it close, Maya," called out Derek from behind the front desk, not looking up from his phone. At 19, Derek was only a year younger than Maya, but he acted like he owned the place just because his dad was the facility manager. "You know the rules about punctuality." Maya grabbed her flashlight and ring of keys from the employee locker. "Yeah, well, some of us don't get driven to work by Daddy in a BMW." Derek's face reddened, but before he could respond, Maya was already heading toward the back corridors. She preferred working alone anyway, especially on the night shift. Shadowbrook Storage was a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and outdoor units that stretched across 12 acres to the outskirts of town. During the day, it buzzed with activity. People moving in and out, trucks loading and unloading, kids riding bikes through the wider aisles. But at night, it became something entirely different. Something quieter. Something watching. Maya had been working here for 8 months, ever since she graduated high school and decided to take a gap year between college. The job wasn't glamorous, mostly checking locks, doing security rounds, and dealing with the occasional break-in attempt. But it paid decent money for someone with no experience, and the night shift meant fewer people to deal with. She started her first round in Building C, the newest section of the facility. Her footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she walked down the long corridor, checking each unit. The smell hit her before she reached Unit C-47, a sweet, cloying odor that made her stomach turn. "Jesus," she muttered, covering her nose with her sleeve. It smelled like something had died in there, which wasn't entirely unusual. People stored all kinds of things in these units, and sometimes they forgot about perishables. Last month, she'd found a unit full of rotting fish that some guy had planned to take on a camping trip. But this smell was different. It was worse. Maya checked her clipboard. Unit C-47 was rented by someone named Marcus Webb, paid up through the end of the month. She knocked on the metal door. Sometimes tenants worked late in their units, though it was against facility rules. There was no answer. The smell seemed to be getting stronger, seeping out from under the door. Maya tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door rolled up with a rusty screech. The smell hit her like a physical blow, so strong that she stumbled backwards, gagging. Her flashlight beam swept across the unit, revealing something that made her blood freeze. Bodies. At least 6 of them, stacked against the wall like cordwood. Men, women, of all different ages, all in various stages of decay. Some looked fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. Others were older, much older. Maya's scream caught in her throat as her flashlight beam settled on something else. Movement. One of the bodies, a middle-aged woman in a torn floral dress, was twitching. Her fingers flecked slowly, and her head turned toward the light with a wet, grinding sound. The woman's eyes opened. They were cloudy white, like cataracts, but they fixed on Maya with unmistakable hunger. The woman's mouth opened, revealing black gums and broken teeth, and she let out a low moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Maya stumbled backwards as the woman began to move, rolling up the pile of bodies with unnatural, jerky movements. Her limbs bent at wrong angles, but she just kept coming, pulling herself across the concrete floor toward the open door. "No, no, no!" Maya whispered, fumbling for her radio. Derek, I need..." The radio crackled with static. "Maya, what's your..." Derek's voice cut out as something crashed in the background of his transmission, and then silence. More movement in the unit. The other bodies were starting to stir. A man in a business suit sat up slowly, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. A teenage boy with most of his face missing began to crawl toward the door. The sweet smell of decay grew stronger, mixing with something else. something that smelled like ozone and burnt metal. Maya slammed the unit door shut and ran. Her footsteps pounded against the concrete as she sprinted down the corridor, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. She had to get to the front office, had to call the police, had to... The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. Maya's radio crackled again, but instead of Derek's voice, she heard something else. Moaning. Low, hungry sounds that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. She reached the junction between buildings C and B and stopped. The smell was here too, wafting from the other corridors. How many units? How many bodies? A metallic bang echoed through the building, the sound of a storage unit door being forced open from the inside. Then another, and another. Maya's hand shook as she tried Derek's number on her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. How was that possible? She'd had full bars just an hour ago. A shuffling sound came from behind her. Maya spun around and saw them emerging from the red-lit corridor, figures moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait. The woman in the floral dress was on the lead, her arms reaching out as she moaned. Behind her came the businessman, the teenager, and others Maya hadn't seen clearly before. They moved slowly, but with terrible purpose. And there were so many of them. Maya ran toward Building A, hoping to reach the main office, but as she rounded the corner, she saw more figures emerging from that direction too. They seemed to be coming from everywhere, shambling out of the shadows with their cloudy eyes and grasping hands. She ducked into the nearest corridor, Building B, storage unit 200 through 299. Her breathing was ragged, and her heart was hammering so hard that she was sure they could hear it. She pressed herself against the wall and tried to think. What the hell was happening? This has to be some kind of sick joke, some elaborate prank. People didn't just come back from the dead. They didn't... A hand grabbed her shoulder. Maya spun around, swinging her flashlight like a weapon. It connected with something soft and wet, and she heard a grunt of pain that sounded almost human. Almost. In the red emergency lighting, she could see him clearly. Derek. But not Derek. His face was pale and slack, his eyes cloudy white like the others. Dark fluid leaked from his nose and mouth, and there was a huge bite mark on his neck, the flesh torn and ragged. Derek? Maya whispered, backing away. Derek, what happened to you? He opened his mouth and let out the same low moan, reaching for her with fingers that were already turning black at the tip. Maya swung the flashlight again, catching him in the temple. Derek stumbled but didn't fall. Didn't even seem to feel it. Maya ran deeper into Building B, her mind racing. If he was like them, then whatever was happening had already spread beyond the storage units. How far? How many people? She tried her phone again. Still no signal. But wait, there was a landline in the manager's office in Building A. If she could just... The lights came back on, the normal fluorescent brightness replacing the emergency red. For a moment, Maya felt a surge of hope. Maybe someone had fixed whatever had gone wrong. Maybe help was coming. Then she heard them. Dozens of voices, all moaning in unison. The sound echoed through the buildings, bouncing off concrete walls and metal doors. And underneath it, she could hear something else. The sound of storage units' doors being ripped open, metal screeching against metal. Maya found herself in front of Unit B-242. The lock was broken, hanging loose from the door handle. The unit was open, empty except for a few scattered boxes and something else. Scientific equipment, microscopes, computers, glass containers filled with strange, glowing liquid. There was a notebook on one of the tables, filled with handwriting. Maya grabbed it and flipped through the pages, her flashlight illuminating the words. Day 12. The compound is working better than expected. Cellular regeneration is occurring even in severely degraded tissue samples. However, there seems to be a loss of higher brain function. Day 18. Subject 7 became mobile today. It shows no recognition of previous identity of relationships. responds only to stimulus, movement, sound, the presence of living tissue. Day 23. I've made a mistake. The compound isn't just regenerating cells, it's spreading them. Every organism it touches becomes a carrier. I have to destroy the samples before. The handwriting became shaky, then stopped altogether. Maya looked at the glowing containers more closely. Several were cracked. Their contents leaked across the table and floor. The same ozone and metal smell she'd noticed earlier was stronger here. A shadow fell across the doorway. Maya looked up to see them gathering. Derek, the woman in the floral dress, the businessman, and at least a dozen others. They stood there swaying slightly, their cloudy eyes fixed on her, waiting. Maya clutched the notebook tighter. According to what she'd read, these things were drawn to movement and sound. If she stayed perfectly still, maybe they would lose interest and wander away. She held her breath and tried not to move a muscle. The creature stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then slowly, they began to shuffle away, their moans fading as they moved toward other parts of the facility. Maya waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, then crept out the unit. She had to get to that landline, had to call for help before this spread any further. She made her way through the corridors, moving as quietly as possible. Twice she had to duck into empty units as groups of the creatures shambled past. They seemed to be searching for something, or someone. The front office was in sight when she heard the sound of breaking glass from outside. Maya peered through one of the narrow windows and saw vehicles in the parking lot. Police cars, ambulances, even what looked like military trucks. Men in hazmat suits were setting up some kind of perimeter. Help, finally. Maya ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't open. The electronic lock system was engaged, something that only happened during facility lockdowns. She pounded on the glass, waving at the figures outside. One of them saw her and spoke into a radio. Maya couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could read his lips. We have a survivor inside. The relief was overwhelming. Maya sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was over. Whatever nightmare this had been, it was finally over. Then she heard a voice over a loudspeaker. Attention! This facility is under quarantine. No one enters or leaves until the situation is contained. Maya's blood went cold. Quarantine? But she wasn't infected. She was fine. She just needed to get out. Needed to... The notebook. She still had the notebook with every description of how the compound spread. Every organism it touches becomes a carrier. Maya looked down at her hands. They were covered in the same glowing residue she'd seen in Unit B-242. She'd been in that room for several minutes, breathing the air, touching the contaminated surfaces. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass door, pale, frightened, but still human, still alive. For now. Outside, the figures in hazmat suits continued their work, setting up equipment she didn't recognize. One of them held up a device that beeped rapidly when pointed toward the building. Maya's radio crackled to life one last time, but instead of static or Derek's voice, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Her own voice, calling out just as she had earlier. Derek! Derek, I need... But she wasn't speaking. Her mouth wasn't moving at all. The beeping from outside grew faster. Maya looked at her hands again. The glowing residue was spreading, creeping up her arms like some kind of luminescent infection. And underneath her skin, she could see her veins beginning to darken. The moaning started softly. So soft. She almost didn't notice at first. But it was there, coming from somewhere deep in her chest. A sound she couldn't control, couldn't stop. Through the glass door, Maya could see the figures in hazmat suits backing away from the building. One of them spoke into his radio again, and this time Maya could hear him clearly through the building's intercom system. Containment failed. Recommend immediate sterilization of the entire facility. The lights began to flash, red, then white, then red again. Somewhere in the distance, Maya could hear a countdown beginning. She turned away from the door and walked back into the building, her movements already becoming stiff and unnatural. The notebook fell from her hands as her fingers began to blacken at the tips. Behind her, the other creatures emerged from the corridors and storage units. Derek was there, still in his Shadowbook storage uniform. The woman in the floral dress, the businessman, dozens of others, all shambling forward, their arms outstretched. Maya opened her mouth to scream, but only that low, hungry moan came out, and the countdown reached 0. Epilogue from the Millbrook County Gazette, 3 days later. Hazmat incident claims lives at local storage facility. A gas leak at Shadowbrook Storage resulted in the deaths of 2 employees and several customers Tuesday night. According to county officials, a chemical spill from illegally stored materials created toxic conditions that proved fatal to anyone exposed. The facility has been permanently closed and will be demolished next week. County Health Department officials stressed that there is no ongoing danger to the community. The family of the deceased have been asked for privacy during this time. In an unrelated story, several residents of nearby Millbrook reported unusual behavior among local wildlife, with several pets and farm animals displaying what veterinarians describe as unprecedented aggression. Officials say there is no connection between those incidents and the storage facility accident. The newspaper clipping was found 3 weeks later, in the pocket of a hiker whose body was discovered along the Millbrook Trail. The hiker has been dead for at least 2 weeks, but his body showed signs of recent movement. His eyes were cloudy white, and his fingernails were black. The search for other hikers reported missing, and the area continues. So, I kind of like the idea of having a story where it's just straight up like a man-made virus. A lot of the ones I've done, it's either they don't ever actually explain what happened, or it's some kind of paranormal thing. So it's kind of interesting to me to have some kind of virus created in a random storage facility. I can't remember who recommended a storage facility worker, but here it is. If you remember that you're the person that recommended it, thank you. But thanks for listening. Hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember your ears. Bye.
What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today I've got a story for you about a priest struggling with his faith prior to the zombie apocalypse and then working through that as the zombie apocalypse happens. So I hope you guys enjoy the story. It's called The Last Prayer. Father Michael Brennan knelt before the altar of St. Augustine's, his knees grinding against the worn stone that had supported countless prayers over the decades. The candles flickered in their brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the crucifix that seemed to mock him with its silent presence. Outside, the October wind rattled with stained glass windows, each gust a whispered reminder of his doubt. "Show me," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast emptiness of the church. "Give me a sign that you're still there." The silence stretched on, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. Michael had been having this conversation with God, or with the void, for months now. Ever since little Emma Reeves had died of leukemia, despite the fervent prayers of her family and half the congregation. Ever since his own mother had withered away in their sterile hospital room, calling his name with her last breath while he held her hand and felt nothing but the terrible weight of absence. 43 years old, 20 of them in the service to the church, and Michael Brennan was losing his faith like water through cupped hands. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the movement. The church felt cavernous around him, too large for the dwindling congregation that gathered here each Sunday. Salem's Crossing had been dying a slow death for years, hemorrhaging young people to the cities and leaving behind only the stubborn, elderly, and the economically trapped. The parish council had been making noises about consolidation, about closing St. Augustine's and merging with St. Mary's over in Millfield. The thought of it made Michael's stomach clench with something that might have been grief, if he could still feel such things properly. The heavy oak doors groaned open behind him, and Michael turned to see Harold Wickham shuffling in from the night. Harold was one of the constants, 78 years old, arthritic hands that shook when he lit his votive candles, but never missed a day. He came in every evening at 9:30, rain or shine, to light a candle for his dead wife, Margaret. "Evening, Father," Harold said, his voice a papery whisper in the silence. "Harold?" Michael managed a tired smile. "How are you holding up?" The old man shrugged, already making his way to the bank of votive candles along the south wall. "Day by day, you know. Day by day." Michael watched him go through the ritual, the careful selection of a fresh candle, the trembling hands that he touched to the wick of the flame of another. It was beautiful in a way, this faith worn smooth by decades of practice. Harold never questioned, never doubted. He simply believed, as naturally as breathing. Michael envied him that certainty. "Father?" Harold's voice called from the shadows. "You all right? You look tired." "Just thinking," Michael replied. "Don't mind me." But Harold was studying him with the sharp eyes that bellied his frail appearance. "You know, Margaret used to tell me that faith wasn't about never having questions. It was about asking them anyway and trusting that the answers would come to you when needed them most." The words hung in the air between them like incense. Michael felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but its faint echo. "She was a wise woman," Michael said. "That she was." Harold finished his prayer and turned to go. "Don't stay too late, Father. Even God rests sometimes." After the old man left, Michael stood alone again in the flickering candlelight. He pulled out his cell phone to check the time. Almost 10 o'clock. He should lock up, go back to the rectory, try to sleep. Instead, he found himself scrolling through news headlines, a habit that had become compulsive over the past few months. The world was full of darkness, wars, climate disasters, political hatred, random violence. Where was God in any of it? The first headline that caught his attention was local. Multiple animal attacks reported in western Massachusetts. He clicked through to read about the dogs and cats found dead, their bodies showing signs of savage bites. The authorities were warning pet owners to keep their animals indoors. Probably coyotes, the article suggested, though the pattern of wounds was unusual. Michael was about to close the browser when another headline appeared. CDC investigation unusual illness in Vermont town. This one was more concerning. Dozens of people hospitalized with fever, delirium, and violent behavior. The article was vague, mentioning only that the patients seemed unresponsive to normal treatment and that several had attacked medical staff. A chill ran down Michael's spine that had nothing to do with the October wind. He closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket, but the unease remained. Outside, Salem's Crossing slept under a canopy of stars. Michael locked the church doors and walked a short path to the rectory, its footsteps echoing off the empty street. The town had always been quiet, but tonight it felt different. Expectant, somehow. Like the silence before a storm. He was fishing for his keys when he heard it. A low moan, coming from the direction of the cemetery behind the church. Michael froze, listening. There it was again. A sound of pain or distress that made his priestly instincts kick in despite his spiritual malaise. "Hello?" he called softly. "Is someone there?" The moaning stopped. Michael waited, straining his ears, but heard only the rustle of dead leaves. Probably an animal, he told himself. A wounded deer, maybe. But his feet carried him around the side of the church anyway, toward the wrought iron gate that separated the yard from the cemetery. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the weathered headstones standing like broken teeth in the silvery grass. Michael pushed through the gate, which gave a protesting squeal that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is anybody hurt?" he called again. Movement caught his eye near the back of the cemetery. by the old section where the stones dated back to the 1800s. A figure was hunched over one of the graves, its back to Michael. Relief flooded through him. Someone visiting a loved one, overcome with grief. He'd seen it before. "Excuse me," Michael said, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" The figure straightened slowly and turned toward him. In the moonlight, Michael could make out what had once been a woman, elderly, wearing a faded floral dress that he recognized. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who had died just 3 days ago, who should be lying on the ground beneath 6 feet of earth. But Eleanor Hastings was standing in front of her own grave, and the front of her dress was dark with what looked like soil and something else. Something wet. Her eyes were clouded white in the moonlight, and when she opened her mouth, that terrible moaning sound emerged again. Michael's mind rejected what he was seeing. It was impossible. A hallucination brought on by stress and doubt. Eleanor Hastings was dead. He had performed her funeral service himself, had watched her casket lowered into the ground. Eleanor took a shambling step toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural. And that was when Michael saw the earth around her grave had been disturbed. Not dug up from above, but pushed up from below. Clods of dirt and fragments of wood that might have been coffin pieces lay scattered around the site. "Eleanor?" Michael's voice came as a whisper. She moaned again and lurched forward, her arms reaching out toward him. Michael saw her fingernails, or what was left of them, were caked with earth and torn down to the quick. She had clawed her way out of her own grave. Instinct finally overcame shock, and Michael stumbled backwards. His heel caught on a low headstone and he went down hard, his palms scraping against rough granite. Eleanor continued her shambling approach, and in the moonlight, Michael could see that her lips and chin were stained dark with something that wasn't soil. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The rectory door slammed behind him as Michael threw the deadbolt and leaned back against the wood, his heart hammering. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. People didn't just rise from the grave. Not like this. Not as mindless things driven by hunger. But even as his rational mind struggled to process what he'd been seeing, his phone was buzzing with an incoming call. The display showed Sheriff Martinez. "Father Brennan." The sheriff's voice was tight with stress. "Thank God you're answering. We've got a situation developing, and I need you to stay inside and lock your doors." "What kind of situation?" Michael asked, though part of him already knew. "We've got reports of... I don't know how to say this. People attacking others. Violent attacks. Some of the attackers..." Martinez paused. "Some of them are people who should be dead, Father. People we buried weeks ago." Michael sank into the kitchen chair, the phone pressed to his ears. "I saw Eleanor Hastings in the cemetery." "Jesus Christ." A pause. "Sorry, Father, but this is happening all over town. We've got Molly Pritchard attacking her own grandson, and she's been dead for a month. The Kowalski twins, dead in that car crash last spring. They're walking around downtown, and they're biting people, Father. Tearing into them like animals." Through the kitchen window, Michael could see lights coming in the house across the street. People were waking up to a nightmare. "What do you want me to do?" Michael asked. "Stay put. We're setting up an emergency shelter at the high school, but right now it's not safe to move around. I've got 3 deputies dead already, and..." The line crackled with static, then went dead. Michael tried calling back, but got no answer. He tried 911 and got a busy signal. His hands were shaking as he set the phone down and tried to think. The dead were rising, the actual dead, climbing out of their graves and hunting the living. It was biblical, apocalyptic in the most literal sense, and it was happening in Salem's Crossing, Massachusetts, on a Tuesday night in October. For the first time in months, Father Michael Brennan found himself praying not only out of habit or duty, but out of desperate need. "Lord," he whispered, "if this is the end times, help me understand what you want from me. Help me know what to do." A crash from outside made him jump. Through the front window, he could see a crowd gathering in the street, but not a normal crowd. These people moved wrong, shambling and lurched with that same unnatural gait he'd seen from Eleanor Hastings. And they were converging on the Hendersons' house across the street, where lights had just come on. Michael watched in horror as the dead began pounding on the Hendersons' doors. Jerry Henderson appeared at an upstairs window, cell phone pressed to his ear, his face pale with terror. His wife Sarah appeared beside him, holding their 8-year-old daughter Chloe. The front door splintered. Michael was moving before he consciously decided to act. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept in the hall of a closet, a relic from his high school days that he'd never quite thrown away, and headed for the door. His hands were steady now, his mind clear in a way it hadn't been for months. The Henderson family needed help. His parishioners, his flock, were in danger. Whatever crisis of faith he'd been struggling with seemed small and self-indulgent compared to the immediate need in front of him. He stepped out into the night and immediately understood the scope of the catastrophe. The entire street was full of them, the walking dead, shambling between houses, breaking down doors, pursuing the living with single-minded hunger. The air was filled with screams and the sound of splintering wood. Michael ran across the street, hefting the baseball bat. The first one that turned toward him had been Bill Kowalski, dead these past 3 months in a car accident. Half of Bill's face was gone, but he moved toward Michael with reaching arms and gnashing teeth. Michael swung the bat with all his strength, connecting with Bill's skull with a wet crack that would have sickened him under normal circumstances. Bill went down and stayed down. Michael felt a moment of guilt. He had just destroyed what had been once a human being, but it passed quickly. Whatever Bill Kowalski had been, this thing wasn't him anymore. The front door of the Henderson house hung open, torn from its hinges. Michael could hear screaming from inside. Sarah's voice, shrill with terror. He pushed through the doorway and found chaos. 3 of the dead had cornered the family in the living room. Jerry was swinging a fireplace poker wildly, trying to keep them back while Sarah clutched Chloe behind him. One of the attackers was Eleanor Hastings. She must have followed him from the cemetery. The other 2 were strangers to Michael, probably from the newer section of town. Michael waded in with the bat, taking down Eleanor first with a blow that dropped her permanently. The second one turned toward him, a man in his 50s with a ragged bite mark on his neck that was still oozing dark blood, and Michael put him down too. The third one, a young woman in a torn wedding dress, was faster than the others. She lunged at Michael with surprising speed, her teeth snapping inches from his throat. Jerry's poker caught her in the side of the head with a metallic clang, and she staggered. Michael finished her with the bat. In the sudden silence, the family huddled together, all 3 of them staring at Michael with wide, shocked eyes. "Thank you," Jerry whispered. "Oh God, thank you, Father." "We need to get out of here," Michael said, glancing back toward the broken door. "More are going to come." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely under control. "They're everywhere." Michael thought quickly. The church was solid stone construction, with heavy doors and narrow windows. It could be defended if necessary. And if this was truly the end of times, there was a certain rightness to making their stand in the house of God. "St. Augustine's," he said. "We can gather survivors there, and wait for help." They made their way through the chaos-filled streets, Michael leading with the bat, Jerry bringing up the rear with his poker. Other survivors joined them along the way. Old Mrs. Chen from the corner house, dragging her oxygen tank. The Brennan family, no relation to Michael, with their twin toddlers. Tom Vasquez, who ran the hardware store and had armed himself with a crowbar. By the time they reached the church, their group had grown to nearly 20 people. Michael fumbled with the keys at the front door while keeping an eye on the street, where shapes moved in the darkness like a plague of shadows. Inside, the church felt like sanctuary in the truest sense. The thick stone walls muffled the sounds of chaos from outside, and the familiar smell of incense and old wood was comforting. Michael lit the altar candles and several of the larger votive candles, filling the space with warm, flickering light. "Everyone stay together," he told the group. "We'll make our stand here until help arrives." But as the night wore on, it became clear that help might not be coming. Tom Vasquez had a police scanner, and the reports coming through painted a picture of total societal collapse. Not just Salem's Crossing, but towns across New England were reporting the same phenomenon. The dead were rising everywhere. and civilization was crumbling under the assault. Michael found himself thrust into a leadership role he'd never wanted. People looked to him for answers, for comfort, for hope, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. As he ministered to the frightened survivors, holding crying children, praying with the elderly, organizing defense against the undead who periodically tested the church's doors and windows, Michael felt his faith returning. Not the comfortable, unquestioned faith of his youth, but something harder and more real. A faith forged in crisis, tempered by genuine need. These people needed him, and through serving them, he found his way back to God. On the third day, as they huddled in the church with their dwindling supplies, young Chloe Henderson tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Father Mike," she whispered, "why did God let the dead people come back?" It was the question they were all thinking. The theological challenge that would have sent Michael into a spiral of doubt just a week before. Now, he knelt down to meet the child's eyes and found that he had an answer. "I don't know, Chloe," he said honestly, "but I know that he's still with us, even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times. God is with us, and that means we don't face the darkness alone." She seemed satisfied with that answer and curled up against his side as he continued his vigil by the window. Outside, the dead wandered through the streets of Salem's Crossing, but inside the church, the living held fast to hope. Michael's phone had been dead for hours, but Tom's scanner still crackled with occasional transmissions. Most were automatic emergency broadcasts, but sometimes they caught fragments of human voices. Other survivors, other communities still fighting. They weren't alone in this world. On the fourth day, Harold Wickham died. The old man had been declining since the first night. His arthritis medication long since exhausted. He went peacefully in his sleep, and Michael performed the last rites with a heavy heart. They had no way to bury him properly, no way to ensure he wouldn't rise again like the others. "We have to." Jerry Henderson couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. They couldn't risk Harold coming back. Michael nodded grimly. "I'll do it." But as he knelt beside Harold's still form with a knife borrowed from Tom's toolbox, something stopped him. Call it instinct, call it faith. But Michael found himself placing his hand on Harold's forehead instead. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "if this is truly the end times, if death itself has been perverted by some great evil, then I ask you to keep this good man's soul safe. Don't let him be corrupted by whatever force animates the others. Let Harold Wickham rest in peace." He waited, his hands still on Harold's forehead, half expecting nothing to happen. But then he felt it, a warmth spreading through his palm, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since before his crisis of faith began. Hours passed. Harold's body remained still and peaceful. He did not rise. Word of what had happened spread through their small group like wildfire. Some called it a miracle. Others remained skeptical. But Michael knew what he had felt. And more importantly, he knew what it meant. God was still there, still active in the world, especially in, its darkest day. The dead might rise, but they were not beyond God's power to grant peace. Over the days that followed, Michael performed the same ritual over 2 more bodies. Mrs. Chen, who had succumbed to her emphysema, and one of the Brennan twins, who had been bitten during a failed attempt to reach the grocery store. Each time, he felt that same warmth, that same sense of divine presence. And each time, the dead stayed dead. It was on the 7th day that the helicopters appeared. Military choppers, flying in formation over the town. The survivors rushed outside despite the danger, waving shirts and shouting. One of the helicopters peeled off from the formation and circled the church, its loudspeaker crackling to life. "Survivors of the church, this is the Massachusetts National Guard. We are establishing safe zones in Springfield and Worcester. Prepare for evacuation." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The soldiers who rappelled down from the hovering chopper were efficient and professional. But Michael could see the strain in their eyes. They'd seen too much, lost too many. This was bigger than just New England. It was global. "You did good work here, Father," the lieutenant in charge told Michael as they prepared to load the survivors onto transport helicopters. "Keeping these people alive. Keeping them together. That took real leadership." Michael looked back at St. Augustine's. At the church they had sheltered through the worst week of their lives. "I was just doing my job." "No," the lieutenant said quietly. "You were doing more than that. In times like these, faith matters. Hope matters. You gave these people both." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the survivors toward whatever uncertain future awaited them, Michael pressed his face to the window for one last look at Salem's Crossing. The town was dead now, abandoned to the walking corpses that still shambled through its streets. But it had served its purpose. In losing everything, Michael had found that he'd been looking for all along. Not proof of God's existence. That had not really been in the question. But proof of God's presence, God's love, God's power to work through the imperfect human beings in the face of ultimate darkness. His crisis of faith was over. In its place was something stronger and more resilient. A faith tested by fire and found to be true. Whatever challenges lay ahead in this new world, Michael Brennan would face them, not as a man who had lost his way, but as one who had found it again in the most unlikely places. The last prayer had been answered after all. Epilogue. 5 years later, Father Michael Brennan stood before the altar of a makeshift chapel in the Springfield safe zone. The congregation was smaller than St. Augustine's had been, but it was growing. People needed faith in this new world, needed the hope that came from believing in something greater than the daily struggle for survival. He still carried Harold Wickham's prayer book, salvaged from the ruins of Salem's Crossings during a supply run 2 years ago. The old man's faith, simple and unquestioning, had become Michael's model. Not blind faith, but persistent faith. Faith that endured. Outside the safe zone's walls, the dead still walked. Scientists said they were close to a cure, but Michael had stopped putting his hope in human solutions alone. He'd learned that some problems required a different kind of answer. As he began the evening service, Michael's eyes found the faces of his congregation. Survivors all. People who had endured the unendurable, and still found reasons to hope. Among them sat Sarah Henderson, now working as a teacher in the safe zone school. Jerry had died in the second wave of infections, but Sarah and Chloe had survived, their faith intact. "We gather tonight," Michael began, "not to ask why darkness exists, but to kindle light against it, not to question God's plan, but to trust that even in the midst of chaos, that plan continues to unfold." His voice carried through the small space, steady and sure. The crisis of faith that had once threatened to destroy him now seemed like ancient history. He had been broken down and built back up again, refined in the fire of the apocalypse, and emerged stronger. The dead might inherit the earth, but the living still possessed something more powerful than hunger, more enduring than death itself. They possessed hope. They possessed love. They possessed faith. And sometimes, in a world gone mad, that was enough to work miracles. So I understand that this was a very faith-heavy story. Take it for what it is. It's a story about a priest, so obviously it's going to have a lot of elements of God and religion and things like that. But I think there's some good general things you can take from it regardless. You know, you can have faith in other things than God. You can have it in humanity. You can have it in yourself. You can have it in lots of things. Having the power of love and hope, I mean, that's a no-brainer. It's a pretty cliche story ending, but like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.
What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today's story is called The Whitmore House Investigation. I hope you enjoy. Found on a damaged hard drive recovered from 1247 Elm Street, Millbrook. Date stamp indicates recording began October 13th, 11:47 p.m. Audio transcription follows. My name is David Reeves, and I've been investigating paranormal phenomena for 12 years. I've seen things that would make most people question their sanity. Shadow figures, poltergeist activity, full body apparitions. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered at the Whitmore house. I should have known something was wrong when Mrs. Whitmore called me at 3 a.m., her voice barely above a whisper. She claimed her recently deceased husband was still in the house, and that he was different now. Standard haunting case, or so I thought. She offered me 3 times my usual rate, if I could come immediately. Red flag number 1. The drive to 1247 Elm Street took 45 minutes through increasingly empty roads. I chalked it up to the late hour, but looking back, I realized the streets were too quiet. No late night joggers, no cars, no signs of life whatsoever. The radio had been acting strange too. Nothing but static and occasional emergency broadcasts that cut off before I could make sense of them. The Whitmore house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a modest 2-story colonial that looked like every other house in the subdivision. Something felt wrong the moment I stepped out of my car. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and there was a smell I couldn't quite identify, sweet and rotten at the same time. Mrs. Whitmore answered the door before I could knock. She was a thin woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. But her eyes were bloodshot and darting constantly, like she was tracking something I couldn't see. "Oh, thank God you're here," she whispered, pulling me inside. "He's getting worse." The interior of the house was pristine, almost obsessively clean. Family photos lined the hallway, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore at various stages of their 40-year marriage. In every photo, Harold Whitmore appeared to be a gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile. The kind of grandfather who'd slip you candy when your parents weren't looking. "When did your husband pass away, Mrs. Whitmore?" I asked, setting up my equipment in the living room. 3 days ago," she said, wringing her hands. "Heart attack, but he came back that night. Started walking around upstairs. I can hear him pacing, moving furniture. Sometimes he calls my name." I've heard similar stories before. Grief can manifest in powerful ways, creating auditory and visual hallucinations. Sometimes, the recently deceased do seem to linger, as if they're having trouble accepting their new state. I set up my EMF detector, digital thermometer, and audio recorder, explaining each device to Mrs. Whitmore to help put her at ease. "Has anyone else witnessed this activity?" I asked. Her face darkened. "I called my daughter Sarah 2 days ago. She came over yesterday morning to check on me." Mrs. Whitmore's voice dropped to a whisper. "She went upstairs to investigate the noise. I heard her scream. Then, silence. When I went to look for her, I found the bedroom door locked from the inside. She won't answer me." "Your daughter is still upstairs?" I asked, alarmed. "Mrs. Whitmore, if someone's trapped." "She's not trapped," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her eyes wide. "She's with him now. They're both up there, walking around, moving things. They won't talk to me anymore. They just make noises." This was no longer a standard paranormal investigation. I should have called the police immediately, but something about Mrs. Whitmore's demeanor stopped me. She seemed elusive, not delusional, and there was genuine fear in her eyes. Not the confused terror of someone experiencing a psychotic break, but the rational fear of someone who knew exactly what they were dealing with. "I need to go upstairs," I said, gathering my equipment. "No!" Mrs. Whitmore grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You can't. They'll make you stay too." I gently removed her hand from my arm. "Mrs. Whitmore, if your daughter is in danger, I have to help her. That's what you called me to do, right?" She stared at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Be careful," she whispered. And whatever you do, don't let them touch you. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed toward the second floor. My EMF detector was going crazy, the needle jumping erratically between readings. The temperature had dropped to at least 10 degrees since I entered the house, and my breath was beginning to fog. But it was the smell that made my stomach churn. That sweet, cloying odor of decay was getting stronger with each step. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a narrow hallway with 4 doors. 3 were open, revealing a bathroom, a spare bedroom, and what appeared to be a home office. The 4th door, the master bedroom, was closed. I could hear something moving behind it, a rhythmic shuffling sound accompanied by what sounded like wet, labored breathing. I approached the door slowly, my digital recorder in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The EMF detector was screaming now, maxed out completely. I pressed my ear to the door and immediately recoiled. The sounds were clearer now, definitely footsteps. Strong somehow. They were dragging and uneven, like someone was having trouble lifting their feet. "Sarah," I said softly. "Sarah, are you okay?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard a voice. A woman's voice, but distorted like it was coming from underwater. "Oh, me." I tried the door handle. Locked, just as Mrs. Whitmore had said. But as I examined the lock more closely, I realized something was wrong. The door wasn't locked from the inside. It had been damaged. Deep gouges ran along the door frame, as if something with claws had been trying to break out. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural moan from behind the door, followed by what sounded like something heavy hitting the floor. Then silence. I made a decision that, in hindsight, probably saved my life. Instead of trying to force the door open, I pulled out my phone to call 911. No signal. I tried again, moving to different spots in the hallway. Nothing. Downstairs, I could hear Mrs. Whitmore moving around, muttering to herself, but her voice sounded different now, strained, like she was having trouble speaking. I started back down the hallway when I heard the bedroom door rattle violently behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The door was shaking in its frame, and I could hear multiple voices now. A man's voice, deep and distorted, and the woman's voice from before, both calling out words I couldn't quite understand. The door stopped rattling. In the sudden silence, I heard Mrs. Whitmore's voice from downstairs. "David? Could you come down here, please? I need to show you something." But something was wrong with her voice. It was too cheerful, too sing-song-like a bad impression of politeness. And she was calling me by my first name, which I hadn't given her. I crept to the top of the stairs and peered down into the living room. Mrs. Whitmore was standing with her back to me, perfectly still. Too still. She wasn't breathing. "David?" she called again, still not moving. "I really need you to come down here." My blood went cold. I hadn't told her my name was David. I had introduced myself as Mr. Reeves, and she had called me that throughout our conversation. I backed away from the stairs, my mind racing. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the bedroom door opening behind me. I turned, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and what I saw will still haunt me for the rest of my life. Harold Whitmore stood in the doorway, but this wasn't the gentle grandfather from the photographs. His skin was gray and mottled, hanging loose in places like an ill-fitting suit. His eyes were clouded white, and his mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained dark with what I hoped was just decay. He was wearing the same clothes he'd probably been buried in, a navy suit that was now torn and stained. Behind him, I could see Sarah. She looked similar to her father. Gray skin, clouded eyes, that same slack-jawed expression. But she was younger, maybe in her 30s, and the transformation seemed more recent. Her business suit was relatively clean, suggesting she'd only recently joined whatever this was. They both turned toward me with that jerky, unnatural movement. Harold's head tilted to one side with an audible crack, and he smiled, a horrible, too wide grin that split his cheek. "Investigator," he said, his voice like gravel. "Come, investigate." Sarah giggled, a sound like breaking glass. "Stay with us." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my equipment. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Whitmore's footsteps on the stairs. That same wrong, dragging gait I'd heard from the bedroom. "David," she called sweetly, "don't be rude to my family." I was trapped. The hallway was a dead end, with the two things in front of me and Mrs. Whitmore coming up the stairs behind me. My mind raced through everything I knew about paranormal encounters, but nothing in my experience had prepared me for this. That's when I remembered the spare bedroom. I lunged for the open door, slamming it behind me and turning the lock. It was a flimsy interior door, but it might buy me some time. The room had a window facing the backyard. I ran to it, fumbling with the latch as I heard the family gathering outside the door. They weren't pounding on it or trying to break it down. Instead, they were just waiting. I could hear them whispering to each other in voices too low to understand. The window finally opened, and I looked down. It was a 12-foot drop to the ground, but there was a decorative awning that might break my fall. I gathered my equipment. The digital recorder was still running, and I had a feeling this evidence would be important. As I prepared to climb down the window, I heard Mrs. Whitmore's voice clearer now. "You can't leave, David. You've seen too much. You belong with us now." The door handle began to turn. I didn't wait to see if the lock would hold. I threw my equipment bag out the window and followed it, landing hard on the awning before rolling to the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me going. I limped to my car as fast as I could, constantly looking back at the house. In the upstairs window, I could see silhouettes watching me. Not just 3 now, but what looked like 5 or 6 figures. The infection, if that's what it was spreading. My car started on the first try, and I peeled out the driveway. In my rearview mirror, I could see the front door of the house standing open, and figures beginning to emerge. They moved with that same wrong, dragging gait, but they were moving faster now, almost running. I drove through the night, my hands shaking on the wheel. Every radio station was playing emergency broadcasts now, though most cut out before delivering complete information. The few coherent messages I caught painted a picture of chaos. Reports of violent individuals in multiple cities, hospitals overrun, and authorities recommending people stay indoors. It wasn't until I reached the interstate that I saw the first roadblock. Military vehicles, armed soldiers, and a checkpoint that looked like it had been set up in a hurry. I pulled over and was approached by a soldier who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sir, you need to exit the vehicle," he said, his rifle at the ready, but not quite pointed at me. "Officer, I'm a paranormal investigator. I just came from a house where—" "Sir, we know about the house," he interrupted. "We know about the families. How long were you in contact with the affected individuals?" "Affected individuals?" I asked, climbing out of my car. "The infected," he said grimly. "How long?" I told him everything. The investigation, the family, my escape. He listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he spoke into his radio in military jargon I didn't understand. "Mr. Reeves," he said finally, "you're going to need to come with me for observation. Standard quarantine protocol." "Quarantine? For how long?" "Until we figure out how this thing spreads," he said. "Could be days, could be weeks. But sir, you're one of the lucky ones. Most people who go into those houses don't come back out." As they led me to a medical trailer, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "How many houses are there?" The soldier's face was grim. "As of this morning, 743 in this state alone, and the number's growing." The transcript ends here. According to military records, David Reeves was held in quarantine for 14 days before being released. The Whitmore house was destroyed by controlled demolition on October 20th, along with 47 other affected residences in the area. Mr. Reeves' current whereabouts are unknown. This transcript was recovered from his abandoned vehicle, found on Route 15 approximately 30 miles from the quarantine zone. Note: This document is classified under Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha. Distribution is restricted to authorized personnel only. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that story. Like I said, I've been trying to do some different stuff lately, and I really like these kind of odd zombie type stories. This one's it's got a paranormal feel to it. Might as well have a paranormal investigator be the one to check it out. So, hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good night, and remember to always face your fears.